Good morning. I am delighted to be here. My name is Hari Han. I'm from Johns Hopkins University. I'm delighted to be here today as your moderator. So I'm glad that I'm here, really not to talk at you, but really to sort of pull out the stories of the other people on the panel. And the goal of our panel today, as Sabeel discussed, is really to ask this question of what do we need from civil society for civil society to become a source of countervailing power in relationship to markets and the state. And in thinking about that, there are a lot of questions that come to mind, right? Can we do the work that we need to do in the context of a multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy? And most importantly, perhaps, the question for us to all ask today is, what does that require of us, right? In the room today, I think we have funders, we have scholars, we have organizers, we have leaders, we have writers. We have people who are coming at this question from a wide variety of angles, and I think the question that we want to ask really is, what does it require for all of us to do in order to rebuild civil society as a source of power that we want to make democracy work? I have to really start by giving kudos to the conference organizers for putting the civil society panel first. I think a lot of times I come to conferences like this about democracy, and civil society is almost like an afterthought. Right? In rooms like this, what often ends up happening is we go straight to thinking about questions about how we design policy, how we design institutions, how we design the things that we can more easily control. And I think the question that we're trying to think about here is, how do we begin to put people back at the center? Right? And what do we need to do in order to really make civil society more than just an afterthought? And so part of what I'm really excited about to hear from the panelists today is that they have all led really important work in the organizations that they're working with to help us understand the ways in which we engage with each other, the ways in which we sort of build communities and organizations where people are beholden to people, shapes our ability to realize the goals and the power that we want. And so we're going to try to bring that story out. So I'm going to start just by introducing everyone on the panel today. Immediately to my left here is Chuck Mingo. Chuck is the teaching pastor at the Crossroads Church. For those of you who don't know, Crossroads is an evangelical church in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's the 4th largest church in the United States, the fastest growing church in the United States, and they get about 40,000 people per week for services. Wow. Next to Chuck is DaMareo Cooper. DaMareo is the executive director of the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, which is one of the largest state-based independent power organizations in the United States. It's a statewide organization that's dedicated to improving the lives of everyday Ohioans. And then at the end, we have Arisha Hatch. Arisha is the managing director of campaigns at Color of Change, which is the nation's largest racial justice organization that's driven by more than 1.5 million members. So a couple kind of housekeeping notes before we get started. First, I just want to remind everyone to please use Slido to ask questions. We're going to start with some discussion on the panel, but then open it up to Q&A. And we really hope that we can bring all of your voices into the conversation, so please do use Slido. And second, I just want to offer up the idea that we're going to be talking about a wide range of things on the panel. Anything that comes up in conversation that is C4 or electorally related is provided as context only. So Chuck, let me start with you. So you're the teaching pastor at Crossroads now, but maybe you can just start by, I know that your journey to the ministry and your journey to Crossroads is not necessarily direct, so maybe you can start just telling us sort of how you got there.
Sure, yeah. I, first of all, just really happy to be here and excited to be in a room of people who are thinking about big questions like the questions we face today. And yes, my journey in ministry was actually different than what I would have expected. So I grew up in a family of faith, and so that was not the part that was not expected. But I, very early on in life, really wanted to aspire to business success. And so after finishing high school, I grew up in Philadelphia, not too far from here. I got an opportunity to work with Procter & Gamble, and so I was on kind of the career path, that track. And as a part of that was, all roads lead to Cincinnati, because that's where Procter & Gamble is based. And so when I moved to Cincinnati, very quickly I wanted to find a church to plug into. And at that time, Crossroads was meeting in a school. So it was still probably larger than any church I had been a part of. I grew up in a church that used to be a shoe store. But it was certainly very different than my experience. And like often had been the case in my life, I found myself in a church that was majority white. And I remember moving there and living in the suburbs of Cincinnati, coming to this church, liking Crossroads, but realizing, like, if I go to this church, I don't think I'll know another black person in Cincinnati. So I actually wound up leaving Crossroads, but it was one of those things, and I would just call, I've never heard the audible voice of God, but this was about as close as I've ever gotten, saying, go back. And I went back. And what happened over the course of time was, as I was at P&G growing in my career, there was also this growing calling in me that maybe this is a place where I'm supposed to plug in beyond just what I do as a volunteer. And so 12 years ago, I left that corporate path and got into the ministry and became a pastor at Crossroads.
Now, I first got to know you in Crossroads really through the work of Undivided.
Yeah.
Which is, a program that you led with Troy Jackson, who is here today. Troy, who was the executive director at the time of Amos and is part of Faith in Action. And I'm wondering if you can just describe for the room what Undivided is and share the story of how it involved.
Yeah, so Undivided is a 6-week journey that we do with our community at Crossroads. And at this point, we've done it with over 5,000 people, both in our community and beyond. And it's really an honest conversation about race in a place where that often doesn't happen. For me, the journey there was really coming out of, we did something as a church, and it was called the Brave Journey, and it was based on the story of Jesus calling Peter to walk on water. Whether you believe that actually happened or not, the context of that story is a powerful story of faith. And so the question was, what's that look like? Where's the place where you're being called to walk on water? And I don't know what I thought it would be for me, but what it wound up being for me was to be a voice for racial reconciliation and racial justice. And so for me, what that looked like was standing up at my, like you said, Midwestern evangelical church, majority Caucasian audience, and saying, we're called to this. This isn't just something I'm called to, we're called to this. And over the course of the next year, what got birthed was Undivided. And as I think about the timing of that, this was, several years after Trayvon Martin had been shot. This was 9 months after Ferguson had happened. And so there was just a pressure cooker in our country around race. And literally 3 months after saying, hey, we're going in this direction, Cincinnati itself was the location of an officer-involved shooting of an unarmed African-American man. And so our community found ourselves thrust into this environment where race was on the table whether we wanted it to be or not. And I think about that and the opportunity that God gave us to actually say, hey, we're taking steps in this direction. And so when Undivided first began, I always think about the first 1,200 people who did it. These were pioneers. These were folks who didn't know what they were stepping into across all kinds of political persuasions and points of view and race. And of those 1,200 people, we did a pre-survey and found nearly 50% of them had never had a person of a different race over to their house for dinner. So Cincinnati, like many cities in the Midwest, is highly segregated. And even in a place where we all go to the same church, sit in a dark room, listen to the same message, it doesn't mean that relationship is happening. And so that's really the heart of Undivided, is to say we need to bring this to a place of honesty. And we do that through a couple things, looking at the history of race and having a real conversation around that, leaning into some of our spiritual tools, like repentance, this idea that you change direction when you are confronted with the truth. And building relationships over time. It's been a powerful way to see people do that. And we've just seen the program impact so many people. And out of that, some of the actions that we've been a part of have really flown from those relationships.
So I'm wondering if I can get you to reflect a little bit more on that, because I feel like part of what I found so remarkable about Undivided is that it does the work of racial healing in a place that we don't expect, right? Evangelical church in the Rust Belt of the United States, a place where the community was really riven by a lot of these tensions around police brutality and a lot of other challenges that we're seeing all over the country. I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit on what was it about Crossroads that made it possible for you to do this work there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things. One of them is Crossroads, we're an activist church. We are. We don't talk about things, we do things. And so that's always been a part of our DNA from the very beginning. And the other piece is, one of the things we say, and we say this regularly at Crossroads, when people come on the weekend, whatever your thoughts are on God, church, or the Bible, you're welcomed here. And so there's this spirit and ethos of belonging that we have as a church that I think created the right environment for us to be able to deal with this topic, And quite frankly, part of it breaks my heart that unfortunately, when you think about where racial reconciliation and justice conversations are happening, that you aren't thinking about the church in the Midwest or anywhere. Because for me, as I read the scriptures, it's baked into the mission of the church. I mean, we should be on the forefront of these conversations. This is a place where if Jesus were alive and walking in the world today, he would be. And guess what? My theology says Jesus is alive and walking through the people who follow him today. So we should be on the forefront of this. But Undivided has been a powerful place to do that. And one of the things we've learned is empathy is this untapped superpower that has to be reawakened in order for us to stay at the table long enough to come to conversations that can lead to solutions.
Yeah. So speaking about solutions, so one of the things about Undivided, right, is it also propels people into action, right, such as the 2016 campaign in Cincinnati around universal preschool. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the work that, you were co-chair of the campaign, so the work that you all did there and the role of that the volunteers from Undivided and Crossroads plays in the campaign.
Sure. For sure. And it's exciting for me to talk about this with DaMareo right here because we really were a part of a broader coalition that OOC had brought together and I think, created a framework for that work to happen. So yes, in Cincinnati, we recognize what we all do, the value of quality preschool education. And it was interesting. I remember going to our board, our spiritual board of the church and saying, hey, I want to chair a public campaign that ultimately is going to lead to a vote in our city. That had never been done at our church. And it was really interesting, the conversation that I had that ultimately landed on, we've tried to be apolitical as a church, but at some point, you gotta get political. And maybe this is a way for us to step into that space. And so kind of with that vote of confidence, was able to do that. And it was incredible. The other thing is coming out of Undivided, like you said, we mobilize people to action. So Amos Project is a coalition of 40 congregations, not all evangelical, not even all Christian, that have come together to be a source of power and change. And so that's where our Crossroads volunteers engage. We had 750 total volunteers do the Issue 44 initiative. 250 of those were from Crossroads. And so together we passed this levy, Issue 44, by the largest margin that had ever been done by a public levy for public schools in Cincinnati history. And so for our church to be a part of that was incredible.
Well, so that's a great pivot. I would love to bring DaMareo into the conversation, because I know that you all partnered on this and you were seeing kind of what the work that was going on in 2016 in the sort of broader context of the state. But maybe you can just start by telling us about how you got into the work that you're doing, DaMareo.
Yeah, so it's very different from Chuck. I'm a kid from the projects, right? Like, single parent mom. I'm sort of like what we think of as like young black man. Excuse me. I'm from the projects. My mom worked 3 jobs. I was telling somebody the other day, she used to do jerry curls. Right? Like people were like, what are jerry curls? Some people know what I'm talking about, right?
I just want to know, did you have a jerry curl?
I did not.
Okay, good.
I wanted one.
You wanted it.
I did want one. Thank God I didn't get it. My family comes from there, right? So like when I was growing up, I can remember being 12 years old, and we moved out of the projects when I was around 12. And I remember being 12 years old, and this incident happened in this place where we moved to, which was like extremely racist thing that happened. Like it's 92 and I run into like the you can't get in our pool because your skin will mess up the water thing, right? In this neighborhood where we had moved to. And I remember trying to figure out like I remember 2 things. One, riding back to my house because I couldn't go over these kids' house thinking like, what's wrong with my skin? And then the other thing being like, who do I tell this to? Because I can't tell it to my mom because she works 3 jobs. And kids who know like your mom is stressing, you're not trying to add more stuff. And then I was thinking like, well, who else could I tell this to? And like and looking back, I remember all of my uncles were incarcerated at this moment. On my mom and my dad's side, all of them were incarcerated. So fast forward, I participated in the world like like people in my neighborhood did, like what I saw, like the community I was from. But I also had hip hop. And I don't tell the story like this, but I need to start adding hip hop into this story because I was being educated by hip hop, Outkast and like Brand Nubian and these tapes my cousins were giving me, which was contextualizing the world that I was living in. Although I still participated in some things, I ended up going to the Marine Corps. I came back home, and I realized 2 things when I went to the service. And this is all part of how I got in this work because when I went to the service, I found out and realized, looking back on it now, that like poor kids go and die for this country. Like poor kids from the hood communities or the trailer parks or the poor town, that's who go and die for this country. I was in the Marine Corps. And so I came home and people were doing the same thing when I got back home. And I was like, well, I'm gonna go to school and I'm gonna go to school for psychology because I need to figure out what's wrong with my family, right? Real life, right? Like something's wrong with my family, everybody's getting locked up. And I ran into this idea around structural functionalism while I was in school. And I was like, well, wait a minute. So this theory is like everything inside of a structure works to serve the structure. And if it doesn't work, then the structure will will get out of it. It has to serve a function inside the structure. And I was like, well, what was the function of all of my uncles being incarcerated? Like, what was that about? And so that led me to start thinking about criminal justice. I left college and I went and worked at Acorn, like all good social activists. You know what I'm saying? Shout out to Acorn, they just killed you because you're doing good work. So I worked there, and then I came back to Ohio, and I got a job working for MVOC. And MVOC in Ohio ended up being the one of the anchor groups with Amos and another group in Cleveland called NOAA that built the Ohio Organizing Collaborative. So I kind of showed up in the context of these experiences that I had, and how I had seen the world playing out and understanding like something was wrong, but it wasn't really my family, right? And there's a part that happens inside of, particularly, I think, young Black activists where you realize like what's going on, right? And there's like a conviction that happens because you're like, wait a minute, oh, this is actually what's like these things we're watching, like this is not a figment of my imagination. It's not me. It's not my family. It's not like us, like what we're taught, that it's our fault that we live in the projects and that's why all my uncles, and this was our fault. And then going from that to, no, actually there's a structure. And that kind of propelled me into organizing and realizing that it's going to take my family to actually, like people in my family, people from my community are going to be the folks that actually change what's happening. So I kind of got in like that. That's how I come into this work.
Well, I will say that, you know, as an academic, I'm delighted that you brought structural functionalism into the conversation. I'm tempted to make the next question about that, but to spare everyone else in the room. You know, maybe like, if we could bring it back to 2016 and the work that was going on in Cincinnati, from where you sat kind of with a statewide view of what was going on in the 2016 election in Ohio, what was similar or different from relative to what you saw in Cincinnati?
So across the state, so our organization in 2016, we registered 184,000 people to vote in the state of Ohio. We ran the largest voter registration program in the state that year. But what happened the year before, we ran a small voter registration program working with some national partners and funders we ran a small voter registration program, but it left us with resources in order to take the key folks inside of our field team and keep them on to prepare for 2016, which was critical for how the base of the 44 campaign gets set up. And so I remember, so this is when I knew something different was going on, to be honest. So Chuck and Troy invite me and Doran to this training, which is like, I'm thinking it's gonna be like a church training. You know, I've done 100 church trainings. You know, it's gonna be like 40 people in a basement or something. We're gonna do power and I walk in this room, it's like 300 people. It was like 300 people in that room. And I was like, wait a minute, something different's going on. And these people were like about, you know, talking about race and talking about like these issues. And across the state, like we were doing our organizing campaigns, all of our voter registration, I should say this because this stuff is important, that all of our voter registration programs has a political education in it, right? So our canvassers are not like the canvassers that you hire when you hire a contractor to do canvassing. When you hire somebody to go and do canvass, what they do is go pay a bunch of people, grind them into dirt, and then get done with them. Like that's what they do. Like they're not concerned about whether they understand ideology. They're not concerned about whether they know this stuff we just saw in this video. They're not concerned about the larger and broader arc of social justice. They're getting paid. And so they're gonna do the voter registrations for you, and you're gonna be able to say, I got these voter registrations, but you're actually not gonna do anything inside of the people who did the voter registration for them to understand why we need to do this. Right? It's just not there. And so our VR programs actually put political education inside of the voter registration program. Why? Because poor people normally don't have time to read the books that we all do. But when the VR program shows up, it's the best job in some of these communities, right? And you go around talking to people. So we said, well, we got this time with you. Why don't we use this time to help contextualize the world we live in?
Yeah.
And so the things that are different that's happening, like everywhere else is running a VR program, but a year before that, we came together and we had created something called the People's Platform, which you didn't talk about, but this campaign came out of a People's Platform. So Amos had put together their leadership And they had created a people's platform that had school to prison pipeline as one of the planks on the people's platform. That's where the entire ballot initiative around this, universal pre-K came from. It came from people saying, like, what do we need to be working on inside of our communities? And then that got translated with organizers, with leaders, it manifested into an actual thing that people could then go vote for. So the difference that was happening inside of Hamilton County that was not happening everywhere else, and this was a presidential year, right? But what's happening in Hamilton County is actual people from communities, from churches, connected to an organization are out volunteering to do something that they all decided they wanted to do, right? Like that the platform was leaning into. And so I feel like, and when you look at it, that initiative passed I think it was 62 to 38, right? It was a huge margin, right? And then when you look at the map for where places that showed up were, it was Hamilton County that actually got more votes than Hillary Clinton, than Obama that year. Hillary got more votes than Obama in Hamilton County in 2006.
So one of only 2 counties in Ohio where Hillary outperformed Obama.
Outperformed Obama. It was one of them was Hamilton County, where we ran a ballot initiative that was a citizen-initiated ballot initiative.
Right.
And the other place was Franklin County, where we were running a prosecutor campaign that was connected to a young man, Tamir Rice, who had got shot. I'm sorry, Tyree King was, Ohio's. Yeah. Ohio is crazy with the police shootings. But Tyree King had got shot in Columbus, and we have built to organize, so the movement moments that you see in there, like you were saying, like movement moments actually create the energy, but you need organizing and organizations to actually drive that to a thing. So in Columbus, we were actually driving this thing, and there was a prosecutor race there. So you see like this turnout come out of like a grassroots prosecutor race, which we end up losing that prosecutor race because somebody from the Green Party got in. No knock on the Green Party, but we lost that by 4 points, and the Green Party person got 6 points. Whatever. But yeah, we were running these grassroots campaigns in these places, and I think that actually had a huge impact on what happened when it came to Election Day. But it's organizing. There have been years of organizing inside of it.
Okay, so I want to pull Arisha into this conversation because I feel like listening to Chuck and DaMareo talk, we have this, conversation about sort of relationship and about community and the sort of power that can come from that coming out. But, there aren't a lot of organizations like Crossroads or the OOC out there, right? And so what does this look like in digital spaces? And I'd love, Arisha, for you to reflect on that. But can you start, I love hearing you tell your story and how you got into this work. So if you could just start by telling us about how you got into the work, that'd be great.
Yes. So my name is Arisha, and I'm always shocked to be speaking in this space because about 10 years ago, I didn't understand that this world even existed. I am the daughter of Ollie, a salesman from East Austin, the daughter of Patricia, who was a 5th and 6th grade teacher until she recently retired, who grew up in Lampasas, like an hour outside of Austin, this little country town. They were a city boy and a country girl that met at college. And I always grew up understanding that I was supposed to be a lawyer. Perhaps because my grandmother wasn't allowed to be. She didn't graduate from high school immediately, got married and was pregnant at 15, had 5 children. Perhaps because my father couldn't afford to be. When he graduated college and went to his dad and said, hey, I want to go to law school, he was like, well, how are you going to pay for that, son? So perhaps because I was one of those like argumentative little girls, like that's what they tell argumentative little girls, like you should be a lawyer. Like it's like low-key shade. But so like I always understood this to be my purpose in life. And so I did all the things, went to undergrad, went straight through to law school, didn't even think about it. And was the editor of the Law Review, all of these things. It was just like this like perfect, never really gotten below a B in my life. And I was living in California, as I mentioned, that's where I grew up. And I went to go take the bar exam. And I failed by 4 points. The California bar is like a 3-day test, and so like 4 points is just like like that's like a couple of multiple choice questions. And I was like, okay, cool, no worries, I got this. Went to take it again. failed again by 4 points. And so in the summer of 2008, when we were in the middle of this like very vibrant election, I was really lost. I already knew I was working or had an internship at this corporate law firm, big corporate law firm, swanky, had a great apartment. And I already knew that I didn't want to be a lawyer. It wasn't anything like I thought it was going to be. It wasn't like Ally McBeal at all. At all. It's like, where were the good-looking men? I was like, where are they? This is not like how it's supposed to be. But I decided that I was going to go back and take the test, mostly because I didn't want to feel defeated by it. And so I went and took the test. There was actually an earthquake in the middle of it, which is an aside, but I won't get into it. The earthquake saved my life. But I had 3 months. I had just quit my job at this corporate law firm. I had to like walk in after I failed the bar for a second time, and all the white men looked at me. I remember like really identifying with Hillary Clinton after she lost Iowa and had to like walk into the State of the Union. Like I'd do that like death march and to go like, quit my job. And so I had several months off before I had bar results back. And I was like, what can I do? And somehow Obama had just won the general or the primary. And I found my way to Mingo, mybarackobama.com. And at the time they had this like calling tool online. And you could make phone calls. And I was like, I'm almost a lawyer. I'm basically a lawyer. Like, I should call and argue with white people about why they should vote for Obama. Like, I would be really good at that. And so I did this online from my swanky apartment that I knew that I couldn't afford after 2 months because I didn't have a job. And at some point, I sort of ran out of phone numbers, and something like popped up and said, did you know that there was an office down the street from you that you can go into? And I was like, there are offices? I had no idea. And to remind folks, I grew up in a conservative county in Southern California. And although my family was registered Dems, regular voters, I don't remember getting a knock on the door. We didn't get mail. We didn't get phone calls. We didn't have this battleground state experience. I didn't understand then that my black family in Southern California in this conservative county who came from Austin and Lampasas, Texas, this conservative state, that we fell outside of every single algorithm of who candidates believe that they should invest in, who independent political organizations and foundations believe that they should invest in. I didn't know. I had no idea that I was outside the algorithm. I didn't grow up with politics in the traditional sense around the dinner table. And so I was like, okay, cool, there's an office. So I like walked into the office and it was still being put up. I remember there was a woman with red hair and she was placing carpet tiles down. And I said, I'm here to phone bank. And I sat down in the office that morning and I phone banked the entire day, closed the office down. Came back, they're like, you wanna come back tomorrow? I was like, sure, I ain't got nothing else to do. Came back the other day, closed down the office. And at some point, one of the few paid organizers in California for the Obama campaign said, hey, are you coming back tomorrow? I was like, sure. Why don't we go grab coffee at some point? And so she sat me down, she asked me why I was there, what my story was. She told me her story, and then she made a very specific and urgent ask. Mm-hmm. And she said, Arisha, I'm forming a team of super volunteers. We're gonna call it
super volunteer.
We're gonna call it Super Team, and I want you to join Super Team. And I was like, yes, totally beyond Super Team. It wasn't until a few weeks later when I went to my first Camp Obama that I realized this was a one-to-one. Yep. And that there are these people who call themselves community organizers, and they would go around having one-to-one, sharing their stories, making very specific, urgent asks, in order to improve and create a vision for the world that they wanted to see. It wasn't until months later after Barack Obama was elected and I got invited to like one of the staff inaugural balls and I was like getting a drink and Jay-Z was about to perform. I thought I was just like living my best life. And someone was saying how all the staff got to keep their laptops when they got their last check. And I was like, wait, you got paid? Like, how did this happen? And so that is, I didn't negotiate well at all. But all to say that is like the foundation of my entry point into community organizing. I thought that I was a community organizer then. I know now that I was more like a data collector, like I was running phone banks. But I very much believe, because of that experience, in the power of the grassroots and the power of people coming together. In this particular office in Berkeley, there was me, this girl that had just failed the bar twice. There was another woman who had just lost her job. We were all looking for purpose and a sense of community, and somehow found ourselves together trying to achieve one goal. And so I just became addicted to that. I became addicted to this idea that people coming together could feel more powerful and actually do something amazing together. So that's how I got into
Super leader.
See, my children are so relieved that I'm not on the panel asking other people questions. So Arisha, I remember one of our very early conversations talking to you about how Color of Change has this approach to sort of thinking about its own power that I thought was sort of really clear-eyed and I think has been the basis for how Color of Change has really evolved its strategy over time. So if you could tell us a little bit about how you all have thought about your own evolution, that'd be great.
Yeah, as an online organization, we thought about ourselves when I joined back in 2012, 2 weeks before Trayvon Martin was killed, as an organization that gave people strategic things to do in moments of crisis and trauma that helped to advance some sort of policy or issue mission that we were focused on. And so we were like doing that for years, built up this list of 1 million+ members, maybe it was 750,000 at the time. I, as a community organizer, was always deeply cynical about digital organizing. Just because I just felt like a lot of petitions, like what is the purpose of that? But when I got to Color of Change, I realized there was so much more happening behind the scenes, at least at this particular organization, than just sending out an email or retweeting someone or posting something on Facebook. We were actually trying to mobilize voices together and target specific decision makers around changes. And I saw this very early through the work that happened after Trayvon Martin's death and the work we were doing with ALEC. We had sort of decided that it was time to stop protesting in front of ALEC's building. They didn't really care about us or Black people, and that the folks that we should be focusing on are corporations. And we got into the work not because of Trayvon. We initially got in because of the spread of voter ID laws and the fact that this had come back to this one organization, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and all of these corporations, many corporations that have diversity departments committed towards Black people, big public brands that said that they cared about us. And so prior to me joining Color of Change, we were writing letters and setting up meetings, sort of getting blown off by these corporations like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Kraft and others, talking about how, Coca-Cola, it's fine that you want to sell soda to elementary school kids. It's kind of not fine, but it's really problematic that you are supporting the spread of these voter ID laws. You can't advertise to Black people during the day and then come for our votes at night. They sort of shook us off. They were like, okay, whatever. And when Trayvon Martin was killed, we were doing research and found out that these stand your ground laws had come from the same unit and committee within ALEC that was also pushing voter ID laws. And then we sort of sprung into action, and there was a whole sort of story there. But I was learning at the time the power of putting voices together, the power of targeting brands, corporate brands who might have a reason not to want to disappoint Black people. But as we moved to 2014 and we watched Black people, mostly Black people, take to the streets in Ferguson after Mike Brown was killed for days, as we watched that become a trending hashtag across the country, across the world, we realized, although Black Lives Matter was this new vocabulary word or phrase that people were using, we began to realize at Color of Change how truly powerless we really were. We were in a state, we had a Democratic state's attorney, a Democratic district attorney who refused to indict a ham sandwich, which is what I was always taught. We had a Democratic elected senator who refused to speak out against that state's attorney's unwillingness to indict a ham sandwich. We had a Democratic governor who also wasn't saying it. We had a whole party, the entire world was watching our movement have this discussion about police violence, and we were more powerless than we had ever been. And so, and these, as folks remember, 2014 sort of started, but every other week, there was another video. There was another video. There was another video. People were starting to ask those questions like they do about big movements like Occupy and the Women's March, like, what's the point? You know, like you can turn people out to marches and into the streets, but what progress are you making? And so we really felt the pressure of that, and we were throwing around all these ideas, and a lot of folks were throwing around all these ideas, and we kept coming back to, it's the prosecutor. Like, it's the prosecutor that's the problem. When I was in law school, like, I would have never been a prosecutor. Like, I was like, maybe I'll go do a stint in the public defender's office just to, you know, feel good about myself. But I would have never gone to the prosecutor's office. Those were the police. Those are the people that we were taught to fear. And so as we began to move forward, as we tried to think about what is the strategic thing that we can give Black people to do, Black people and our allies to do, we began to land on, it's the prosecutor. It's simple. It's the prosecutor. And so we began to convene folks. A lot of people were sort of arriving at this community, at this idea sort of separately in local communities. And so we started to convene folks saying like, hey, you're working on the prosecutor, you're focused on like marijuana legalization or bail reform or immigration. Like, how can we begin to reimagine together what a progressive prosecutor looks like? And we came up with a set of 6 demands. We want them to be more transparent. We want them to hold police officers accountable. We want them to end money bail that kept poor people in jail before receiving a trial. We wanted them to decline to prosecute a set of things, whether it was petty offenses like marijuana, or decline to use the death penalty, or decline to use plea bargaining as a way to sort of shackle people too soon. And so we got together and we sort of arrived at those things and set about trying to find a set of candidates who were willing to go on the record saying that they supported at least some of that vision. And so one of the things that I'm most proud of in our work is that after years of folks wondering whether the movement for Black lives would actually achieve tangible results, we went back to Ferguson. We went back to St. Louis County, and we took out the prosecutor, Bob McCullough, that refused to indict Mike Brown's confessed killer. And since then, folks have continued in the community to organize around forcing this new prosecutor to show up in the way that we imagined that we wanted. And so we have a local squad there in St. Louis, and they've started a court watch program. We're like a national organization. We're like, oh God, they want to do something. Like, this is freaking me out. But they wanted to have a court watch program. Mm-hmm. And so 3 times a week, they've trained about 50 people. 3 times a week, they've come up with a set of questions or that they want to answer, and they're just tracking. And they've been doing this for about 3 months, 4 months maybe. And one of the things that they've arrived at, we didn't have to tell them this. They understood this. They've experienced their system. They started to ask questions like, why is the judge recommending these ankle monitors? Like, what's that about? And so they started keep putting a check mark every single time the judge said, okay, no bail, but we'll give you an ankle monitor. It costs you $400 a month. Can you afford that?
Yeah.
And they're now not only collecting data that we're going to go back to Wesley Bell's, the new state's attorney's office with to make recommendations, but they're now doing deep strategic work to figure out how can we get rid of these ankle monitors. They're researching the corporation that is profiteering. And it's just been beautiful to see how folks are, who once had to take to the streets, who once set Ferguson on fire, who once felt completely powerless in a situation, now reclaiming their power.
So I'm getting the sign from the people that we're running out of time, but I want to ask you one more question, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to sort of think about what we're hearing across these stories. And so, just one question: can you also talk about the work that Color of Change has done around Black joy and how that feeds into your capacity to build power in the ways that you're talking about?
Super quick, one of the really intentional choices that we made as we began to shift from an organization that was digital first, believed that its members wouldn't come out to take action in real life. A theory that has been proven wrong based on the more than 30 to 40,000 people that have come to events in the last 2 years. Whether it's a Black women's brunch or a Black family fun day or a Black dad's cookout, is that so much of our current organizing work has been born in trauma. And we saw the manifestations of that as we went to and talked to our friends at BYP 100, as we went and talked to our friends at Black Lives Matter. And so one of the things that we did was try to be really intentional about trying to create a space that is centered in Black joy. That the vision for the world that we're trying to create together, because we're not just trying to elect a person president and then move outside of the community, we're not a pop-up shop. We fundamentally want to create neighborhood squads that are committed to one another. And so we started hosting a brunch, and we invited women from our email list who are super active voters. We also put Facebook ads up targeting low propensity voters. And the theory was, what if we could bring irregular or non-voters into community with our super voters, with our super volunteers? What would the outcome be? And beyond that, what if we didn't start with a transactional ask? Like, we want you to go vote or register voters, or we want you to go deliver this petition. Actually, what we want you to do is sit at this table and talk about your favorite girl group of all time. Is it the Supremes or Destiny's Child or TLC? Like, we actually want you to build a sense of commitment to one another. Because fundamentally, if we are building communities, squads, fundamentally, those people have to want to hang out together. Like, it's not just, sometimes you can get into a campaign and it's all about that campaign and people are purpose-driven enough. But we wanted to build teams of people who were committed to empowering Black joy, who were committed to each other. And in the process, we believe that they'll show up and try to talk to people about the importance of participating in the census, that they'll be able to talk to people about the importance of voting in a specific election. And so that's the work that we've been trying to do in a really distributed way without tons of local organizers on the ground, but sort of asking people to build a commitment to one another, a commitment to their community, and that's what we're testing out. Stay tuned. It could work.
So as I listen to all of you speak, I feel like there's certain things that I keep hearing, and what's interesting to me is across kind of technology, across geography, across ideological type of spaces, across faith communities and things like that, there's sort of this story about people beholden to people, right? That's grounded in commitment and relationship and leadership and this sort of negotiation for power, in a way that's accountable to those people that is emerging. But even as I hear these themes, I know that I've had conversations separately with each of you about how you feel like the work that you're doing is an uphill battle, right? So can you reflect a little bit on what makes it uphill? I want to throw this kind of question out to all of you. Why is it that in all these very different kind of contexts that you're working, from an evangelical church to a national digital organization, why does that work feel so uphill?
Well, I guess it's me. Nobody wants to answer this question. So part of it is like there is a historical narrative that has been dividing communities in this country, right? Like that's the way power is built, is by dividing a set of people who would be your opponents. And if they were together, we would have enough power to actually move what we need to move. So that's really one thing. I think another thing is sometimes it feels like folks who should be your allies are not, right? We was in a meeting yesterday and someone stood up and was like, actually I'm from an inner city and the Democratic Party was the people who did the most damage, right? But we are kind of doing the work of the party. I think that's another thing. And I think the party's sort of schizophrenic a little bit, like this is our base, right? These people are our base, but we are actually in a kind of economic way worried about this base of people having too much power. So how can we activate them and not really activate them? You understand what I'm saying? Are people with me? Mm-hmm. Right? So I think like that feels a little weird. And then the other thing is, so we ran a campaign last year. Like, just talk about this thing that happened last year. So we ran a citizen-driven, so 44, we learned a lot of lessons from the ballot initiative that happened in Hamilton County. And then we expanded those lessons and moved a criminal justice ballot initiative in the state of Ohio. And there were so many things that were happening inside of this. Why it feels like an uphill battle sometimes is because when you need to move and say certain things inside of the community, there is like a buffer group that is like, the poll says this, the poll says that, and the focus group said this and that, but they're not necessarily connected to the base. But the thing that happens is that funders and foundations give those intermediaries the resources. Mm-hmm. So even though I know, and my leaders and the people that we work with, we know what we need to be saying in order to move this issue, we don't have the resources to enforce our agenda, and so it feels like sometimes you're playing this like, and I'm saying this in the room at the Ford Foundation. I feel weird saying this at the Ford. I'm sorry, y'all, but I'm like realizing this, and like please continue to fund us. But this is the truth. It needs to be said. Yeah. It's like a group of folks who are not accountable. So you keep talking about this accountability thing. Like there are people in this room that I'm accountable to. And like, honestly, I know that I'm accountable to them. Mm-hmm. But there's a group of folks who have zero accountability to the people in this room. And the people that I'm accountable to in this room are accountable to other people who, and the accountability kind of keeps going down until you're like dealing with your base. Mm-hmm. And like you actually have a base. And what happens is people who are not accountable to bases get to make decisions about what we do as organizations. So not only are we fighting like this narrative, this historical narrative that says like my community is valueless and like we don't actually deserve rights and dignity, right? We're fighting this thing, which is the thing we're all supposed to be fighting. Then there's this other thing that is like, and you don't deserve the resources to figure that problem out. There's somebody else who can figure this out for you, and then you have to implement their plan. And then what we're doing, to just be real with you all, these community organizations and grassroots organizations, what we're doing is trying to figure out how to meet your deliverables that are given to us through these other people, at the same time actually do with our communities and people on the ground. We know what we need to do, right? And we're trying to balance this thing at the same time. And that's just the truth of what's real. I don't know what people write in there. I do know what people write in their grant reports. But that's the truth, And because nobody's saying, I don't know if it's because nobody's saying it or if people don't want to hear it, but until people on the ground get the resources to do the things that we know we need to do, until y'all start trusting us and y'all start trusting these people who are living these lives, who are the experts in these experiences, then we're going to continue. It's going to be like this dual battle we're fighting, from my position anyway.
So I'm getting the flashing end sign, but I want to give Chuck and Arisha a chance to reflect on this. And then just to sort of prime you all, we're going to then give you all a chance to sort of reflect with people around you about what this means for your own work and how what the things that we've talked about might implicate the sort of choices that you'll make in your own work. But first, let me just give Chuck and Arisha a chance to sort of weigh in on this question of, what makes it uphill and what would you be calling from people in this room if you could?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that comes to mind, Arisha, I want to encourage you on what you're doing around Black joy. And I think that's true in every context. I think one of the things that makes this work hard is when you're isolated in the work. Yeah. And the priority has to be on both mission and belonging. You can't have one without the other. I really believe that. And so I think that's an encouragement for all of us in the room, is to make sure that we are thinking about our rhetoric and thinking about our resources, funding things that are not only bringing to bear mission, but are also bringing together belonging, and the kind of belonging that builds bridges versus the things that can only be, targeted at mission, or even things that may in some ways be promoting othering in other ways. I think it's so important that community and mission go together. And that's where life comes from, right? That's why people can stay in a fight long enough to actually see change, because the journey mattered, I mean, there's a part of connection and belonging that comes from, and out of that comes the kind of life that we need. So I think that's a big part of it. Like, what does it look like to think about funding and fueling families on mission? Yeah. That's what we need, families on mission.
That's great. There's a lot of ways in which I think we think about it as an uphill battle. And so it's not just that our people, my people, feel powerless to change government or to change corporations that are making decisions that affect their daily lives. It's not just that sense of disenchantment and powerlessness. It's also that we're living within an industry and an ecosystem in which a bunch of people are profiteering off of keeping those people feeling powerless. And so we have this mode of investment in which rich people, in which corporations invest in candidates, invest in these, the parties invest in these electoral pop-up shops that have no relationship to community. And what it does, the effect of that is that it keeps politicians and corporations on safe ground, while leaving our communities, mostly poor people, mostly communities of color, lots of Black people, out on the ledge. Right. And we're fine with that, because it continues to allow rich people to have the access to power that they want and need. It allows candidates, allows corporations to not fulfill the promises that they've made to us. And it just keeps us in this position of begging, and unconnected. We've all been made into data collectors in some sort of way, not the strategic thinkers that we actually are, not the implementers of change that we actually are. And so we have to shift our mode of investment, I believe, into a system in which we're actually putting candidates and corporations out on the ledge, where they feel unsafe, where they feel like they could fall at any minute, and get our communities back into safe ground. And so it means not always listening to this set of profiteers, the data nerds, and I'm a data nerd, but the data nerds and the tech geniuses who believe that they were the ones that elected Barack Obama. They are the ones that are responsible for all the positive change that's happened in the world. And begin investing in the people that I met in that Berkeley office in 2008, who were doing everything possible without any paid staff, who didn't know paid staff existed, in order to achieve a vision that they wanted to see in the world.
Thank you. So we're going to open it up to questions. I know we're running behind, and so I just want to give people a few minutes just to sort of reflect with people around you on sort of what you've heard, and then we'll sort of take questions for a few minutes. So what we'd love for you to do is just take maybe 5 minutes, turn to someone close to you who maybe you haven't met before, introduce yourself, and the question that we want you all to reflect on together is this question that's up on the screen. If we want civil society to be a source of countervailing people power and not just action, what shifts are required in our organizations. So if you can just take a few minutes, turn to your neighbor, turn to someone behind you or next to you, and then we'll pull you back and take questions for a few minutes. Okay, so we want to take a few minutes to hear your all's kind of reflections and questions. We had some great questions that come in over Slido, but we also know that you all have been sitting for a long time. So maybe I'll just sort of start by asking one question to the panel, but then if you have questions or reflections that you want to share, there's a mic on either side of the room here. And for the purposes of recording, we need people to sort of go up to the mic to share their thoughts and responses. So we invite you all to sort of please take take a moment, like think about what you want to share from the conversations that you just had, or your reflections on the panel, or any questions that you want to ask the panelists, and we'll try to have about 10 minutes of questions before we wrap up. So while we wait for people to come up, maybe I'll just sort of start with one question. Ooh, I just lost the Slido thing. But I do remember one of the questions was actually, Chuck sort of was towards you about Crossroads, where someone in the audience sort of said that Crossroads seems like such a really interesting and fascinating church, but it's unusual in the broader context of evangelical churches, partly because the churches themselves are not often run democratically inside them. Right. So I'm wondering if you can just say a little bit about sort of how your work evolved within Crossroads, or how Crossroads governs itself as a church.
Yeah, so the governance of Crossroads is probably very similar to other churches. We have a spiritual board. You might have heard of them as an elder board in other churches, and so that's kind of the primary governing structure. And then it really is a staff-driven church. And what I would say is, unlike other churches, our board really sees their role as supporting kind of what the staff feels inspired to run after, within some guidelines for sure. But there's a lot of opportunity for entrepreneurial thinking in the context of our staff. And many of the things that are now a part of our church started with someone who wasn't even on staff. Some of the key initiatives that we do was somebody saying, hey, we should be about this as a church. And actually now there's infrastructures to support it. So we are, but typical to other churches, there's a governance board and then kind of staff leadership from there.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we have a question, Marshall.
Thanks, Hari. Thank you all. This was terrific, really. It's a wonderful, wonderful presentation, beginning and hope providing as well. My question is then, if the power of civil society rests on the assumption of autonomy, in other words, that it can hold the private sector and public sector accountable because it depends on neither one for its power. Democracy promises that through state power, it's possible to access enough to counter economic concentrations of economic power. But since Buckley v. Vallejo, that money is speech, it's enabled the private sector to colonize the political apparatus. Philanthropy colonizes the civil society organization. And so my question is how to regain the autonomy that depends on people, not on philanthropy and not on politics that's been purchased, but the capacity of people to sustain their own organization with their own resources, their own capacity, and in that way exercise real accountability and real power.
Small question. You guys can answer as quickly as you can, because I know we have another question too, and so I want to make sure that we have enough time.
Is that me? Is that you? That's me? That's us.
Arisha, do you want to jump in?
I'll try to take it. And not to ask y'all to stop giving us money, but we're thinking a lot about alternative revenue models and alternative revenue streams. Like if we can get to the place where our members can actually drive the work that they want to do. One of the real challenges is that, our members don't see the world in single issue ways, and they definitely don't experience the world in C3, C4 pack ways.
That's right.
And like that is always our like fear, like we gotta protect the C3, we gotta protect the baby, and like, so you try to put all these sort of constraints on the types of work that they can do, and that feels wrong to them. Like, we have women who sat together at a brunch. One of the women was like new to the area. It was a younger woman. It was older women at the table, and she had just lost her mother. And so she was, after they talked about Beyonce and the Supremes and all that sort of stuff at their Black women's brunch table, she sort of communicated to her table, Table 19. They now have a team called Table 19. That her one regret was that she didn't spend more time with her mother learning to cook. And these women, and it's my favorite story, and I don't necessarily think that we're getting funded to like inspire these types of gatherings of people necessarily. But one of my favorite stories is that those women sort of like adopt her. They live in Houston. They've been getting together and having monthly cooking classes. That is not like a metric that we would have told a funder that like leads to an outcome that you would care about. But that is like really what they want, to get together and do cooking classes. A set of women all got passports together because they've never been out of the country before and are gonna go on a cruise next year. There are a set of people that like could really care less about voting and the census. They just wanna like deliver water to other people in Flint. Like that is like power to them. That is Black joy in their community, like fresh water. And so wanting to find ways to give them a platform and enable that, maybe allow them to fundraise for themselves. It shouldn't always be that Color of Change, funded by Ford, is hosting a brunch, because we will never get to the scale, be big enough to actually achieve the grand vision of the world that we want to see, unless folks feel a sense of autonomy and power, and that they have the resources that they need to actually build the communities that they want to build. Great. But we haven't figured it out yet.
Can I jump in?
I'm not gonna.
Amen.
Amen.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for this great panel. My name's Joelle. I work in the economy program at Omidyar Network, which is a funder. And so building off of that last question, do you have any ideas or experiences around how to create accountability in philanthropy, and also how to shift the culture from one that's just about metrics to one that's about shared learning, so that expertise is coming from the people who do the work, and not the people who get the privilege of having the conversation with people who do the work?
Yeah, I'll answer that. So there's actually like groups of people, like there's like a intrepid group of folks who are thinking about this in this way, and like bringing like practitioners and policy folks and philanthropy folks together. Like that is happening. People are doing that now. It's kind of like, it's like a new thing. It feels like a new thing from when I've been around, that like, and I don't want to put nobody out here because I don't know if they're allowed to be, if I'm allowed to say who they are. Cool. Is it cool? I already just put you out by saying that.
Yeah.
But there are like program officers like Ethan, like Emma, like people who are trying to bring folks together. But one good story I could tell is about and it's actually Ford Foundation helped grow this thing, which is called the Ohio Transformation Fund in Ohio, which was actually created with the Ohio Organizing Collaborative and some funders, and like we came together to build this fund to support the criminal justice work in the state of Ohio. We come together quarterly and talk about what OTF is doing, how OTF is moving money. But I think it's important for practitioners to be a part of these decisions. I just think like it feels newer. And I think we just need to grow it out. We need to grow out more of the expertise, because there's so much learning that we can get. And I think for me, the learning is, understand a program officer as another piece of the ecosystem for us building power to get to where we're trying to get as a society, instead of being like, oh, I'm going to this funder to try to get some money. It's like, no, actually, Ethan is somebody who's concerned about social justice, and we're conspiring together about what we need to move forward around. And I just think we just need to grow that out. It's not happening as much as it needs to yet.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Maxim Thorne. I'm the managing director of the Andrew Goodman Foundation. So first, I want to share with you that I'm so glad I spent a lot of my time learning to cook from my mother. Last night, I had enjoyed my own cooking, which was eggplant curry and some dolpuri. And it was the second birthday of my mom since she died early of Alzheimer's. And I'm glad I have been able to do that. So thank you for invoking that. But the reason I'm standing up here is because of a phenomenon that we're observing. So we focus on increasing youth civic power, and particularly the youth voting rate. And I participated in a conference in Atlanta earlier this year that brought together amazing activists, young activists from the South, who were focused on everything from reproductive justice and climate change and sensible gun regulation and mass incarceration and so forth. And in communing with a number of students and folks who were community organizers, postgraduate or non-graduate, very, very committed to this work, and therefore will not participate in this system and vote. Because they're not going to sell out. Yeah. They're not going to be part of a transaction. Yeah. And that's very concerning to me. Yeah. And I was listening to the last two speakers, and we're not a pop-up shop, and yet this resistance is there. And to the middle speaker, I'm just wondering if this is an arc that will get us back to what you were envisioning, or whether this will continue in the direction that leads to total electoral disempowerment. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I left feeling inspired by their independent thought, by what we're doing, and then very frightened about what's going to happen in the all-important 2020 election, for example.
So,
You go.
I keep pushing this button because I talk too much. I'm like trying to time myself. I know exactly that feeling. The one thing I say when I'm talking to folks in community, and they're like, I don't vote, and it doesn't matter, and no one cares, and you're supporting the system if you vote. The next thing I normally ask them, especially if they're a black person, I'm like, which Klans member taught you that? Like, very seriously. Like, where did you get that from, right? And part of it is that we don't have an accurate understanding of the history of this country, right? And we don't have a lot of resources spent on just teaching people political education. Like, no one's funding that. In fact, people will fund you to do voter registration and not fund you to do turnout, which doesn't make any sense. Right, it's like, because it's easy to mark a number for VRs, like, got this many VRs, and it's hard to count whether the conversations you're having on the door are quality enough to convert someone into a voter. But that thing is a real thing. And first, for me, I have to acknowledge that they're not crazy to say that. You know, like, my mother voted every single election. Like, a lot of these people are coming, like, single-parent moms and black women are voting, and they're not seeing anything change. So they're not, you gotta first say, like, it's not just about voting, but voting is one of the tools on the belt that we need to use in order to build what we're trying to build. But it's difficult because, you know, young people want somebody to talk to them. Like, the young people now are even different from, like, they're different. And they're more informed. They're more educated. They're more clear about their demands. And I feel like we have to react to that and understand, like, we have to talk to these people. It's not just enough to be like, oh, we got to go have a youth vote program. It's like you actually have to, like, have a conversation with young people to figure out how they're talking and seeing the world. Their worldview is different. And, like, how do we actually move people along that arc? I think that when we've talked to young people, like, Ohio Student Association is an entire youth project inside of the OOC. And, like, you can see their impact on the work because they're having authentic conversations with young people. And they're, like, actually having that confrontation with them and saying, like, yeah, you're right, I feel you, but if we don't use this thing, then we're just gonna, this is how decisions get made in this system. If we don't use this thing, then we're leaving something on the table, but there's a bunch of other stuff we can use also. Mm-hmm. It's just like not making people think that, like I remember when I first started, people would say stuff like, black people died for you to have the right to vote. Mm-hmm. And I remember this kid said to me, black people dying for $30 worth of crack. Mm-hmm. You know, like, black people have been dying. Mm-hmm. So that's supposed to motivate me to vote? And like, for me, it made me think like, no, actually, this person needs to understand how this structure works. Mm-hmm. And that means investing in the political education that gets people along an arc to understand like, yes, we need to vote and we need to do these other things, you know?
I think what also comes up for me is that we've allowed the parties to take up too much space. Yeah. And it's leading to like really messed up behaviors and consequences. And so in order to like shift the mindset of that particular youth that we're, and I see it all the time, we're completely independent minded. We have reason to not trust or not believe in government. We've now seen 3 presidential election cycles at least where across the board, people are voting for change. Like, they look very different between Obama and Trump, but like people are like over it. They're just like, someone come here and mess this up, shake this up, is what I see happening. And so I think this is where an investment in, as DaMareo said, political education really matters. It's an investment in leadership development that matters, because a commercial that a candidate puts on is not going to change the mindset of that person at all. Us going to knock on their door a week before the election or send them a piece of mail, as if we would even knock on their door or send them a piece of mail, because we don't care about them that much. Right. They won't make the algorithm, just like my family never made the algorithm. So it's like no one's even talking to these people. And so we have to invest in creating a community around them in which people that they trust are actually engaging in these conversations over a longer term arc that I believe will help lead to mindset change. And so like the woman who had lost her mother, who is now cooking with this set of older women, she is not a voter. She is one of the people that like saw a Facebook ad and was like, I really want to go to a black women's brunch on Saturday. Right. And our hope is that as they get together each month and teach her how to cook soul food, that there's going to be a moment when the election pops onto their radar, and that they might be able to have a conversation, and because they held her and because she trusts them, that they are in a better position to shift her voting behavior or her mindset than any of us could ever be.
Okay, I'm so sorry, Heather, but we have run out of time for your question, and I hate to not be able to give you the chance to ask the question, but
I won't ask the question, but I'll just say, amongst many other things, you all give me joy. Oh, thank you.
Heather Bruce.
I'll hold the question for later, because I'll sneak it in. I wanted to know in different ways what it is you need that we could do together to promote your extraordinary leadership, organizing, and promote these stories and reality. And are there things that we can do together that you and we need to build the power that we need to take this and take back the country?
Okay, so we cannot answer the question, but so Kevin is really going to get mad at me, but like one sentence in closing. So one message that you want to leave the audience with. So I'm just going to start with Arisha and then go down to Chuck. And you guys are like, you did not tell me about this. I know, so here we go. So if you had to leave one sentence to close the panel, Arisha.
Oh my God.
No ands, no conjunctions, come on.
We together have to put the community back in community organizing and the social back into social justice. And so anything that helps to facilitate that, I think, has the potential to save the world.
Thank you. DaMareo?
Man, that's pressure.
She stepped up.
Damn. What she said.
Mine is come talk to us.
Right.
Come talk to us.
All right, thank you very much.
All right.